Imagine this. A quiet suburban street, the flashing red and blue lights of a police car cutting through the night. A white officer steps out, full of authority, approaching a man in a sleek black car. But this isn't an ordinary traffic stop. The man behind the wheel is a highly decorated general of the United States Army, calm, composed, and carrying an air of dignity that speaks volumes. Yet none of that seems to matter to the officer who's already made up his mind. What happens next is a moment that will change both of their lives forever. In a world where appearances often dictate assumptions, this encounter quickly escalates into a clash of respect, authority, and understanding. As the officer pushes forward, convinced he's in control, he has no idea what's about to unfold, a moment so powerful, it will leave him questioning everything he thought he knew. As the officer approaches the car, his hand instinctively rests on his holster, a gesture of caution or maybe control. Inside the car, the man sits calmly, his uniform faintly visible under the glow of the streetlights. The polished insignias on his chest are a clear sign of his rank, but the officer doesn't seem to notice or care. His mind is focused on what he thinks he sees, just another driver who needs to be put in their place. License and registration, the officer demands, his voice firm but not inviting. The man obliges without hesitation, his steady hands moving with precision. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asks, his tone measured yet commanding, a voice that's used to being heard. But the officer's demeanor remains stern, almost dismissive. What he doesn't realize is that this man has faced battles far greater than this moment, and he's not about to back down. The officer scans the documents handed to him, but something about the calm demeanor of the driver seems to unsettle him. "Step out of the car," he orders, his voice sharp, leaving no room for discussion. The man's eyes meet his, steady and unwavering. For a moment, there's silence, the kind that weighs heavy in the air. Then, without protest, the man exits the car, his movements deliberate, as though he knows every step matters. The officer, now standing inches away, begins to ask a series of pointed questions. Where he's coming from, where he's headed, and why he's there. Each answer is clear, respectful, but the tension lingers. The officer seems intent on finding something, as if determined to justify his actions. Meanwhile, a small crowd starts to gather at a distance, their murmurs growing louder. Someone pulls out a phone, recording the unfolding scene. But the officer doesn't notice. He's too focused on asserting his authority. The man, however, seems acutely aware of every detail: the growing crowd, the phone cameras, and most importantly, the significance of what's happening. Still, he remains calm, his silence speaking louder than words. The officer's frustration begins to show as he asks, "Who do you think you are?" The man pauses, his eyes narrowing slightly. His answer, when it finally comes, will reveal more than the officer is ready to hear. The man takes a slow, deliberate breath, his gaze unwavering. "Who am I?" He repeats, his voice calm but firm, carrying a weight that seems to cut through the officer's bluster. He steps slightly closer, not in defiance, but with the quiet authority of someone who has stood before far greater challenges. The crowd grows silent, their phones still pointed, capturing every second of the interaction. The officer hesitates for a moment, caught off guard by the man's unshaken composure. "I asked you a question," he snaps, his frustration bleeding through. But before he can say more, the man finally speaks. "I am General Alexander Hayes of the United States Army," he says, his tone steady and clear. "I've served this country for over 30 years, leading soldiers through battles you can't imagine. And right now you're making a mistake that you won't soon forget." The officer freezes, his face a mix of disbelief and confusion. For a moment, the only sound is the murmuring of the crowd, their whispers turning into audible gasps as the weight of the man's words sinks in. The badge on the officer's chest suddenly feels small, insignificant even, compared to the legacy of the man standing before him. But instead of stepping back, the officer doubles down, his pride refusing to let him admit he's in over his head. "I don't care who you are," he says, his voice shaky but defiant. "No one's above the law." The general simply stares at him, his expression unreadable. The tension is now unbearable, the crowd watching with bated breath, waiting to see what will happen next. The general doesn't flinch at the officer's words. Instead, he slowly reaches into his jacket pocket. The officer's hand instantly moves to his holster, his voice sharp. "Stop right there. Hands where I can see them." The tension in the air crackles like static, and the murmurs of the crowd turn into hushed silence. But General Hayes doesn't panic. He raises his hand slightly, speaking with a calm authority that commands attention. "Relax, officer. I'm retrieving my military ID. You might want to verify who I am before this goes any further." The officer hesitates, his mind racing, the weight of the moment suddenly heavy on his shoulders. Finally, he nods, though his posture remains tense. Hayes pulls out the card slowly, handing it over with steady hands. The crowd leans in, straining to see what's happening, their phones capturing every second. The officer studies the card, his brow furrowing as he processes the name, rank, and photograph in front of him. It's undeniable proof. Yet instead of easing up, his face hardens. He shifts uncomfortably, glancing at the growing audience. Pride and fear war within him, and he knows the situation is slipping out of his control. Then a new sound pierces the tense atmosphere, the faint but distinct hum of approaching sirens. Another police car pulls up, its headlights cutting through the night. From the driver's seat steps a senior officer, someone older, more seasoned. As soon as he sees General Hayes, his expression changes, a mix of shock and recognition. "What's going on here?" the senior officer demands, his voice carrying the authority of someone who knows this situation has spiraled far beyond protocol. The junior officer stammers, struggling to explain, but the general remains silent, his calm presence now radiating even more power. The stakes have just been raised, and the night is far from over. The senior officer strides toward the scene, his eyes narrowing as he takes in the tense standoff, the restless crowd, and the unmistakable presence of General Hayes. "Stand down," he orders sharply, his voice cutting through the chaos. The junior officer hesitates, his hand still hovering near his holster, but reluctantly steps back. The senior officer approaches General Hayes with a nod of respect. "General, I'm deeply sorry for this misunderstanding," he says. "We'll sort this out immediately." He turns to the junior officer, his tone stern. "Did you even check his credentials before escalating this situation?" The younger officer stammers, trying to justify his actions, but his words falter under the weight of the crowd's judgment and his superior's piercing gaze. "I didn't. I wasn't sure," he mutters, his face flushed with embarrassment. General Hayes finally speaks, his voice calm but firm. "It's not just about me. It's about the assumptions you made before you even approached my car. This could have been anyone, and the outcome might not have been the same." The senior officer nods, his expression somber. "You're absolutely right, sir. This will be addressed immediately." He turns back to the junior officer, his voice low but firm. "Report to the station. We'll be having a serious conversation about this." As the younger officer reluctantly walks away, the crowd begins to disperse, murmurs of relief and satisfaction filling the air. The tension starts to ease, until the general speaks again. "Before you go," he says, his eyes locked on the junior officer, I suggest you learn the lesson here, not just for your career, but for your life. Respect isn't just earned, it's a responsibility. The officer pauses, glancing back at the man he had so badly underestimated. For a brief moment, something shifts in his expression, a flicker of understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of a change. But as he drives off, the general turns to the senior officer, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over," he says quietly. And with that, he steps back into his car, leaving behind a night no one will forget. As General Hayes drove away, the street grew quiet again, the flashing lights fading into the night. The senior officer stood still, watching the car disappear, a thoughtful look on his face. The crowd slowly dispersed, their phones still buzzing with videos and commentary about what they had witnessed. For many, it was more than just a confrontation. It was a reminder of the power of respect and accountability. At the station, the junior officer sat alone, his mind replaying every moment of the encounter. The general's words echoed in his thoughts, louder than any reprimand he might face. It wasn't just a lesson in procedure. It was a wake-up call to look beyond assumptions and approach every situation with fairness. Meanwhile, General Hayes returned to his quiet life, but the night's events had left their mark. It wasn't about punishment, it was about progress. And with every story shared, it sparked a conversation that had the power to create real change.